So I can't tell you how much that video gave me life when it came out, because I was trying to think how, all this stuff that was going on with Numan Ali Khan and Tariq Ramadan. Of course, it made me pissed off. It made me pissed off at them, first of all, even though I know we're not supposed to do trial by social media and whatever, I was still getting really pissed off. And at the same time, I was thinking, but how do we deal with the backlash, the inevitable Islamophobic backlash? Like, this is really complicated. But then I think one of the things that I really took to heart was the Muslim women who were thinking of creative ways of speaking up. And if we think about theorizing, the thought that goes into defining Islam, it's people like Mona Haidar as well, and her theology and her outlook on Islam. I think it's informed by so many things. She was one of the activists who was protesting at Standing Rock. She's trained by Black liberation theologians, and she's a Sufi, and she's Syrian American, and she's extremely devout. And then she comes up with this, and it's a piece of art. It's not a lecture, it's not a paper, it's a song. She's rapping. And that's the kind of stuff that gives me joy. And that's the kind of stuff I probably attempted a lot in Malaysia as well. I was a playwright. I wrote a play that I think people still talk to me about from Malaysia. They know I'm here, but they still write to me about it. And it was about homophobic bullying in a boys' school, homophobic and transphobic bullying in a boys' school. And there was a lot of Islam and race and a lot of that kind of politics, class politics happening in the play as well. So I think that's where the joy is: storytelling, sharing stories with people, being healed through telling stories together.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing that video as well. That was great. Reminds me of Melissa Wilcox's conception of serious parody, and how interestingly that can be used in religious contexts as well, particularly from kind of within, as it were. I think going on to another topic about your current work, in climate change. So could you tell us a bit about that?
So I threw in this question to prompt you to ask me, because it's something I'm trying to figure out as well. So before I got really passionate about the topic of Islam and gender and sexuality, this is when I was a student in Australia. I come from quite a middle-class background in Malaysia. I'm dual ethnicity. My family's quite hybrid. And I got a scholarship to study chemical engineering in Australia from an oil company in Malaysia. But when I was a student in Australia, this was the late 90s, I had a succession of crises. I've talked about one of them, coming to terms with my sexuality, coming to terms with what I felt about Islam. But another thing was, I learned about the assassination of Ken Saro-Wiwa when I was a student in Australia. And Ken Saro-Wiwa was a Nigerian environmentalist and human rights activist who was trying to basically just defend the rights of his people, the Ogoni people, from Royal Dutch Shell and what it was doing to the Niger Delta with the complicity of the Nigerian military government. And he and his fellow activists were just executed by the Nigerian state with the complicity of Shell. So that was a real, it was a succession of crises for me. First, like, I'm gay, I'm Muslim, what do I do? My studies are sponsored by an oil company. I have to work for them when I graduate, but this is what the oil industry does. What do I do? And then when I graduated and I went back to Malaysia, it was 9/11. So these were multiple stresses, I think, that just, they nearly led to a breakdown. I still had to work at this oil company, Petronas. I had to keep up with appearances because to not work with them meant that I would have to pay them back a whole bunch of money that I didn't have. So I had to work with them for a few years. But in those few years, I started volunteering in lots of human rights and social justice struggles. So this is when I discovered, like I said, Sisters in Islam, Amnesty International in Malaysia. And so for me, being involved in activism in Malaysia was never just about LGBT activism. It was social justice in a more interconnected way. So lots of the feminist activists I met through Sisters in Islam were also doing other projects on, for example, refugee rights, workers' rights, indigenous people's rights. And that's the frame through which I saw feminism. And I think it's a particular kind of feminism. You can call it what you want, post-colonial, third world, whatever. And that's how I interpreted my identity as well as a gay man. But coming to the UK, really wanting to do this PhD on sexuality and Islam, suddenly I think there was a shock to the system. Because then in the UK, I realized that, like you say, there is such a thing as homonationalism. There is such a thing as class privilege and, racial privilege within LGBT movements. There is such a thing as colonial feminism. All these things that I thought were relics of the past, I think came alive to me here. But the concern for other social justice issues never went away. My partner is an openly gay Anglican priest. He does LGBT activism in the Church of England and climate change activism there as well. So we've kind of always talked about the climate crisis, but recently, because my work kind of traverses academia and activism and journalism now, I really wanted to get more involved in the climate space because this was supposed to be the year of the UN conference on climate change in Glasgow. And so it was about building a movement, and especially in religious congregations, because it's not just a moral story that religious congregations can tell about climate change. They have congregations, they have buildings, they have investments, they have transnational connections. So this is a really opportune moment to activate those networks as well to talk about climate change. And initially it felt like, oh, I'm moving into a completely different space. I'm meeting completely different people. I'm doing something completely different. But recently I've thought, there are some similarities between climate activism from a faith-based perspective and trying to talk about gender and sexuality. And I realized, that, I've been talking for a while, so I won't spend a lot of time on this anymore. But just some of the highlights for me are, when people of faith that I meet, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, when they talk about the environment and the relationship between religion and climate, there's always a critical and reformist component. It's like, oh, all these religious people who deny climate change, who deny that we have to take care of the planet, they're not reading their scriptures right, or they're not following the true tenets of their faith, which is what progressive, say, gay Muslims like me would say about Islam as well, when it comes to homophobia or misogyny. And there will be an apologist element as well. The apologist element is if we only followed our religions truly and really connected with the core, we would be protecting the planet. And again, that works within the other space as well. If only we connected with the core ethos of Islam or Christianity, we would be LGBTQ inclusive and so on. This is an argument that progressive Christians and Muslims and Jews will use. So there are those parallels. And also, if we're talking about justice, there's the parallel of denial of responsibility. So the denial of the UK and imperial powers for their histories in spreading racism and homophobia around the globe, and now trying to export LGBTQ activism into the global South. You can have this kind of neo-colonial approach to climate justice as well. It's like blame the Black people for having too many kids, right? Blame all these countries for deforestation without turning, a critical eye back on Western governments and what they are doing with the climate crisis. I mean, there are differences that I don't want to overstate, like, most importantly, I think with homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and so on, there will be a clear perpetrator and there will be a clear victim whenever these crimes happen. And you can have clear legal frameworks to address this, right? But with the climate crisis, there's no clear perpetrator. Something we do here, boiling a kettle here, could kill a child in Bangladesh, right? Depending on what energy source you're using. How do you identify the perpetrator and the victim? How do you, act on this through a robust legal framework? This is what people are still trying to figure out. So I don't want to be facetious about drawing the parallels, but I thought I'd just throw that into the discussion. I don't know where I'm going with that. It's still very exploratory, but I just thought, different ways of thinking about social justice and faith and so on.
Thank you. I think I'll just use this opportunity to remind people that if they would like to submit a question to Shannon, then please put it in the chat. Or put in the chat if you would like to ask a question through BSL. But in the meantime, yeah, I'd like to ask kind of what sort of up and coming projects you have on, what's cooking?
So up and coming projects are, I just had a strategic planning day with Faith for the Climate, which is a UK-based network of different religious organizations that are gearing towards COP26, so the UN Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Glasgow that's taking place next year. So it's really about trying to build a grassroots interfaith movement to take climate action. And so we're going to think about building people's capacities, how to do this, because there are multiple obstacles. One of the obstacles is the UK government's greenwashing of its climate policies. It always says that it's doing really wonderful stuff, but then when you dig a bit deeper, it's like it's not really holding up its commitments, for example, with investments in fossil fuels. So that's going to be quite big this coming year. And yeah, and then trying to manage what's happening within the interfaith space when that happens, because where I work now in Faith for the Climate, it brings together different religious actors that might not even want to speak to each other on issues of gender and sexuality, for example. So I can give the example of conservative Christians and pagans whom I meet in my work, who come together because they care for the climate. But if you wanted to have a separate discussion with them about religion, like they probably wouldn't want to talk to each other in that other space. So it is exciting seeing these relationships happen, you know, what the climate crisis can do to bring people together. But I'm also interested in, well, you know, how much does this social bridging actually work, you know? So it's a bit of an experiment as well, seeing how this network will work over the coming year.
Yeah, it sounds fraught, sounds challenging. Right, we have a question for you here from Beth. Do you have any thinkers you recommend for diving into queer Muslim theory?
Yeah, I think the first person that everyone should read if they want to understand the experiences of queer Muslims is Scott Siraj al-Haq Kugel. And a lot of people like me really owe a debt to him, because he was the first openly gay Muslim to write about queer issues and Muslim societies. And he really took the trouble to unpack everything, especially for a Muslim audience. So I would definitely start with him. The other one that I was mentioning is Kecia Ali, Keciaali. She doesn't really touch on LGBTQI issues explicitly, but she does unpack the constructions of gender and sexuality in Muslim jurisprudence throughout the history of Islam.
Thank you. Oh, could we spell those in the chat?
I'll type Scott Kugel.
Oh, thank you.
Kugel and Kecia Ali. And read me. Read my book.
I was hoping you were going to say yourself. So, yeah, I want to go back to what you were saying about kind of working with different groups of people and trying to reconcile them all together. So obviously there must be some parallels with bringing together different like interfaith factions and talking about kind of quite contentious issues. Do you find that the religion part of that has to be left on one side in order for those groups to cooperate, or can it be actually a productive meeting of faiths together?
I think the interesting thing about the climate space is that, unlike in other interfaith spaces I've been in, people are much more willing to recognize that they have different beliefs, that these beliefs might not always be reconciled. It's almost like belief in caring for the planet becomes an additional part of the theology that everyone can agree on. It's the glue that sticks everything together, even though they might not agree on other things. being in the interfaith space when it comes to LGBTQI issues, I would often feel much more uncomfortable, because in those settings, it would always be like, oh, where the Muslims at? You know, so it's like you find an openly gay or openly lesbian Anglican priest, whatever, you find a Reform or liberal Jew, you find a Buddhist, and it's like, where the Muslims at? Where the imams at? And it did feel at some point like, you know, I did feel quite tokenized in some interfaith panels on LGBTQ inclusion, or being made to answer questions as a Muslim. And I hope I'm not stopping people from asking questions, but I'm just being quite frank with my experiences. There are organizations that do that quite well. I think the Faith and Belief Forum, when they organize the LGBTQ and faith events, I think that's when I really feel like we are all heard. And they also include humanists, you know, atheists and so on in their conception of faith and belief. Which, you know, might be problematic in and of itself, but, you know, that just shows where they're coming from. So there are those sorts of differences that I notice working on climate change, working on LGBT stuff within an interfaith space.
Thank you. Okay, we've got some more questions coming through. Thick and fast now. Fatma's asking, it seems like a lot of focus of anti-queerness in Islam focuses on sodomy and gay men, but very little on relationship between women. Why do you think that is, and how does it reflect on the queer Muslim space?
This is such a fascinating question. And yeah, one of the earlier points that I made about the phallocentrism of how sexuality is conceived in Islamic jurisprudence, like, you know, just, I hope this is a space where I can say this. I have a friend who was doing research on gender and sexuality in Islam in Malaysia. Unlike me, like, I was looking at, you know, lived experiences of queer Muslims in both countries. She was examining the roles of Muslim decision makers, so Islamic leaders in Malaysia, and what they thought of sodomy and homosexuality and so on. And yeah, at one point she was having a chat with one of them, and, you know, whenever they talked about homosexuality, they would talk about sodomy. They would talk about, this is the gravest sin in Islam, da 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 da, and this is why we need laws against homosexuality. You know, and my friend's, she's non-Muslim, she's not a Muslim. Oh, that was an ugly term, non-Muslim, but, you know, that's the Malaysian in me. So she just asked innocently, well, what about two women then? And the guy just looked at her and said, two women? And she's like, yeah, what if two women, you know, had sexual relationships with each other? And I kid you not, he just laughed and said to her, well, that's not a crime. They're just being naughty. You know, we can set them right. So it's kind of this idea that if it doesn't involve a penis, it's not real sex, right? So I think that's definitely something that appears somewhere. This is what we need to talk about when we talk about patriarchy and heteronormativity in certain Muslim political cultures.
Sorry, it's not a crime, they're just being naughty. Could be a good catchphrase for someone.
She was like, her jaw dropped. She was like, I can't believe he's just said that.
Okay, just scrolling up. Okay, so Robert says, there was an allusion in the intro to Shannon's involvement with music. How, if at all, does that part of his life connect with the subjects discussed tonight?
So one of the things I really wanted to do was break out as a recording artist. I used to play music in Australia. I used to play open mics, write songs. And then when I went back to Malaysia, one of the things I did besides getting involved in all this advocacy was I used to play at a club called the No Black Tie. There were songwriters round, and then I got picked up. I got signed on to a record label, and I got to write my own songs. And I chose to record in Malay because Malay is kind of less gendered than English. The third person pronoun is non-gendered, right? So there's no he or she, there's just that person. And a lot of my songs, they were love songs, but it was easier to code them by writing in Malay. So my album was basically a very, very queer Malay album of pining for someone, you know, it's like an album of torch songs and so on. But I could get away with it in Malay because of its non-gendered nature. I've kind of No, my music career didn't really take off, so I got involved in quite a lot of other things, but that's one snippet of my career as a musician.
There really isn't anything you haven't done. I'm loving this deep dive into all your different lives. Okay. Do you think so Yumna's asked, do you think this gender or sexuality discourse has any future in the MENA region? I feel like it's often limited to Western societies where it's much more tolerated.
Of course, I think this is assuming that it's always been easier to talk about these things in the West, but that's not always been the case, right? There was a time when the Victorians thought people in the MENA region were debauched because they were all gay and they were all engaged in sodomy, and all these prudish Victorians were like, we ain't having none of that. So I think it's always a struggle anywhere we are. I think in the MENA region, or in any other Muslim context, it's about what we do about authoritarian governments, because they use sexuality as a tool to control the population, right? And that's what any government does, whether subtly or not so subtly, whether in a liberal democracy or not. So I think if we see things through that lens, then we'll see that the struggle just needs to happen differently in the MENA region. Perhaps we do, lots of the people I met in Malaysia who were openly gay and Muslim, or not so openly gay and Muslim, a lot of what they said was, look, we understand the LGBTQ struggle, but in Malaysia now, the first fight is for democracy. The first fight is for human rights, right? So this is how we must see LGBTQ rights. It is a package that comes with everything else. So we must speak out against corruption, authoritarianism, and so on. Like, it cannot be a single issue struggle.
Thank you. Okay, next question. So I've got to scroll up again. Okay.
Media and cultural work that discusses queerness
Yes.
in Islam in nuanced and interesting ways. There's a play that I saw a couple of years ago called The Funeral Director by a British Muslim playwright called Iman Qureshi. I hope they restage it. It's one of the best representations of Islam and queerness and gender identity that I've ever seen. So The Funeral Director, I'll put that in the chat. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Really brilliant stuff.
Okay, I think, are we on to the four-parter question now? Okay, thank you, Reese, for this. Okay, not sure how relevant this is, and I'm sorry for it being long, rambly, and over-academicized question. I've never said that word before. But if I can take the conversation back to the video, because I was so intrigued by it, while also jumping on the back of Fatma's question. Is there something to say here about the connection of Islamic subjectivity to place and the negotiation of Westness and non-Westness, in brackets, sorry for the clumsy terms, through music and other forms of artistic expression in trying to make a point about trans-regional experiences in Islam, gender and sexuality, broadly, that are not confined to a particular place? And what does it say, if anything, about queer Muslim experiences the world over, or for that matter, anything else? I'm essentially asking you to talk more about connecting the video and other forms of queer Muslim creative expression to some of the other issues of queer Islamness that have also been discussed this evening.
Okay.
Sorry, there's the fourth part. Should I read that?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Maryanne used the term serious parody. I feel this comes across in the use of certain regionalized uses of Arabic in a musical context that quite explicitly seems to echo a particular kind of contemporary popular art world characterized by the priority it gives to Western experiences, as well as evoking sexual and other kinds of deviance, a club beat, rapping, electronic post-production effects, historically European tonalities and so forth, that eventually gets lyrically turned on its head by the subject matter. I think that was kind of a side note.
Okay. I'll address this by just talking about why I liked that video so much and why I like Mona Haidar so much.
Good plan.
I think by using rap as a medium, I think she's using something that many Muslims in the West have connected with so much, you know, especially if they come from more observant backgrounds, like, you know, music is forbidden, it's haram, you can't dance and so on. But, you know, and especially for a Muslim woman, but suddenly to rap connects you to the oral nature of the Quran, the way the Quran is written, and the way you do that exegesis with the Quran, that kind of rhythm of the spoken word, you know, that boundary between poetry and hip hop. I think that's so appealing, not just to Muslims in the West, but when I grew up in Malaysia, you know, so many of the younger Muslims that I meet are attracted to this. And, you know, I think it's essentializing if we sort of compartmentalize rap or hip hop as belonging to a certain culture. And it does, it comes from somewhere. But how does it travel as well? And how do people find their voices within these, you know, genres, I think is really interesting. The other thing is, you know, when we talk about thought, and the kind of thought that we should take seriously, the kind of, you know, the word theology, I think, is problematic when it's used for Muslims, but let's go with it for now. If we're thinking about a queer Muslim theology or a feminist Muslim theology, who gets to theorize? Where are those theories published? You know, who has the privilege of theorizing? And I think that's such a problematic question, because if we look at Black feminists in the US, for example, you know, who have come out of centuries of slavery and then, you know, are denied opportunities for education, denied opportunities for advancement, they're still theorizing about their situation and they're theorizing about change. How do they do it? They do it through the blues, you know, and how does this take place? It takes place through, you know, Aretha Franklin's Respect, Mahalia Jackson, and that is where Black feminist theory resides also, right? It's not just in Alice Walker, it's not just in Toni Morrison, it is in Aretha Franklin, it is in Mahalia Jackson. And so I think this is what Mona Haidar is tapping into, like, who has the right to theorize? Who has the right to respond? Who has the right to do exegesis? And I think, you know, yeah, it comes from a certain context as a Syrian American, but I have women friends in Malaysia, some of whom don't speak English as their first language. You show them Mona Haidar and they're like, yes, love her. Right? So that's what I like about that video.
Thank you. Okay, I think last two questions now. So buckle up for that. Right. Thank you for such a fascinating discussion. Have you had many interactions with queer ex-Muslims who have chosen to leave their faith due to sexuality? And do you have any ideas or views on this? E.g., the Council of Ex-Muslims Britain waving placards at Pride marches.
Yes, I have views on this. No, and I've met many ex-Muslims who are queer, and I empathize, because that's where I am as well some days, and that's where I was before I met people from Sisters in Islam. And, you know, the solution that groups like Sisters in Islam offer to me don't always work for queer people born into Muslim families or Muslim cultures, you know, who grew up under these conditions. It's still not convincing to them. For them, Islam is still an oppressive religion. There's nothing to do but to dissociate, to leave because of the trauma they've experienced and so on. And I get it, and I agree, and I support that. I think it becomes problematic when the ex-Muslim discourse, again, it's about co-opting. Like, who is it in service of? You know, what does it, what are the power relations involved here? And what kind of attitudes is it engendering? Is it really allowing Muslims to have an open discussion amongst themselves about people who are leaving the religion? Or is it actually just creating fodder for far-right sentiment? You know, I think that's the question. So, yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it at that.
That's I mean, it reminds me a bit of how you can't really have someone who's ex-gay who's not inherently homophobic. It's like, how can you be there must be a way of being ex something without being anti something, but that's a very fine line, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, this last comment here. It always seemed to me that feminism is a very universal philosophy by nature, and was surprised to learn that it has prominent sub-disciplines. So I'm curious whether Islamic feminism, for example, would explain feminist values / principles in terms of Islam. i.e. bending feminism to fit religion, or the opposite, bending Islam to fit an idea of feminism?
I think what I would say to that is from my understanding and how I was introduced to feminism, it's become clear to me that it's not a universal philosophy. There are different variants of feminism. If you go back to Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman, the differences between how white women and Black women are seen in America, what constitutes femininity for a free white woman compared to a Black slave woman, and the kinds of ways that they had to respond to male domination. It's not that white women are not dominated against by men, but it takes a different form. It has different ideals. The idea of femininity is different. So, Black feminism does evolve differently. And, I think in a lot of the feminist struggle for much of the 20th century, women who are not white, or people who are not cisgender women, sort of became add-ons, or they became seen as problems, that didn't fit into this universal idea of feminism. When actually, I think, feminism is, in one way, if you want to see it as universal, fine, it's the idea that women are fully human, but that idea can take different forms in different circumstances, and it has to sort of address different architectures of patriarchy and heteronormativity, right? So with Islamic feminism, it's, Islam is not black and white, right? You can find very strongly egalitarian verses in the Quran or stories or whatever within Muslim history. Female role models, male role models. And I think for Muslim women who believe in the religion, this is what Islamic feminism means, finding this answer within the framework of Islam. And if you want to challenge whatever is happening within Islam, you use the tools that you have as a Muslim to challenge those, right? Audre Lorde might have something to say about that. Like, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But then Annie DeFranco, a singer-songwriter I really like, would say, look, any tool in your hand is a weapon. And so that, I think, is Islamic feminism in a nutshell for me.
Oh, that's such a good soundbite to end with, Dr. Shah. I think we're running over a little bit over time now. So thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. It's been great. And I think getting lots of appreciation in the comments already.
Well, thank you so much, Maryanne. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you to all of you here. And again, Ali and Kate and Catherine and everyone at Queer Kings. Thank you.